Well, howdy, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to History Class live from my house here. Today, I have the fun joy of taking some really sensitive topics and trying to walk through the minefield while doing this for public consumption on YouTube. So pray for me that I watch my words carefully. We've been talking about some of the turbulence of the 1970s as it relates to politics. And the Vietnam War and Nixon's corruption and all this kind of stuff. The Ford's unpopular presidency and the pardoning of Nixon and the loss of Vietnam and all these sorts of things. Today we want to talk about some of the other things that were kind of fueling this sort of instability in the 70s. One of which we'll start off at the top. Is some significant economic struggles, and then another is some cultural changes, most notably as it relates to the ideas of feminism. Starting with the economic stuff, one thing to understand about the 1970s is the 1970s is really a decade of struggle for the American economy. After the first 10 or 20 years after World War II had been, really prosperous years. It's kind of everyone kind of has all this 1950s nostalgia in contemporary politics, which I've kind of debunked a little bit before. But nonetheless, it was a pretty prosperous era for us, at least relative to our expectations up until that time. But the 70s is kind of an economic step backward. And some of that was the fault of politicians. Some of it was not. Most of it was. The struggles get really bad in 1973. So we'd already had a little bit of a recession, which had caused Nixon to impose the new economic policy with wage controls and price controls. And that caused an economic downturn. That was the result of an economic downturn. It didn't improve things. Then something big happens in 1973, and that is the Yom Kippur War over in the Middle East, which is where an Arab alliance led by the Egyptians attacked Israel on Yom Kippur, the highest Jewish holy day, the Day of Atonement. Surprise attacked them, started a war trying to get back some territory that Israel had won in the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, America and Israel had a pretty friendly relationship for some time now. We supported them in the 48 War for Independence. We surprisingly took the Egyptian side in the 1956 Suez War, but then in the 67 Six-Day War, we're kind of slightly on the side of the Israelis. Although there actually was this one time where they accidentally fired an American submarine, thinking it was somebody else's, and that was nearly a bad deal. But we managed to avoid getting into all that. But anyway, so 73, we had taken the Israeli side and things, and the Arabs got really angry at us about it. And of course, at the time, quite a bit of the world's oil comes from the Middle East. We're a little less dependent. We're a little less dependent on Middle Eastern oil now than we used to be, thanks to certain technological advancements like hydraulic fracturing or fracking, and a few other things like that. But at the time, a lot of the world's oil came, and to this day, a lot of the world's oil comes from the Middle East, especially Saudi Arabia. Well, by then, all of the world's major oil producers had started a cartel known as OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they met for the purpose of fixing the market to where they won't sell oil at or below a certain price. And because 2/3 of the OPEC countries were Arab, and even the other third were a lot of countries that were less than sympathetic to the U.S. on political matters, OPEC was able to agree to an oil embargo to shut down sales of oil to the United States. So we were cut off from Middle Eastern oil for a period of several years. Well, the thing is, we had, under Nixon's price controls, we had an artificially low price of what people could charge for gasoline that was set at the time. And then we have a shrinking supply of gasoline, which is going to cause increased demand, which is going to cause prices to go up. So if you have and you can see this, not to get into economics, that's more for next year, but we'll go here a little bit so you understand it. It's a similar thing with a couple months ago when you couldn't find toilet paper when this whole thing first started, right? Why was that? Because people weren't dramatically raising the cost of toilet paper, but there was a huge upshot in supply, or excuse me, in demand, because people wanted a lot more than they usually would buy. And so because of that, what you got was shortages. Well, the same thing happens with the oil. We can't charge above a certain price, but the amount that we have to sell is going down. So what that means is the oil is going to sell out. And when the oil sells out, your car can't run. And so literally the government, because they were slow to adjust, I mean, they should have gotten rid of the price fixing immediately, but they didn't. So because of that, what they had to do, they had to go to a system of rationing, where there was a stretch for a few years in the 70s where you could only get gas on certain days based on what letter your license plate starts with. So if your license plate started with A through L, you could get gas on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And if it started with, M through Z, you could get it on Wednesday, Thursday, I don't know what days and what specifics, but that's how they did it, which is crazy to think about. And God forbid you run out of gas on a day that wasn't your day. You had to hope that the gas station would be willing to let you cheat, but if you did that, some people would complain and start fights. It was a bad deal. So when they finally took the price controls up, the price of gas shot up over a 5-year period from being about 35 cents a gallon, which is unbelievable to think about. There's 35 cents a gallon. From being about 35 cents a gallon up to $1 a gallon, which at the time was shocking. Now, before I turned the video on, I plugged in my trusty friend, the inflation calendar, and really, they really weren't paying that much more for gas than we have been. I'm not talking about like right now during the Corona crisis, but over the last couple of years. The $1 there was kind of the equivalent of gas being about, $2.80, $2.85, which is, not all that different than what it has been in recent years. Now, when I was your age, now I feel old when I say that. Actually, a little bit older than your age. This was more when I was in college that the gas prices shot up. But around 2007, 8, 9, gas prices were routinely hitting between like $3.85 and $4.25 or so, which is the equivalent today. The upper end of that is like the equivalent of $5.10 gas. So the fact that we see in today's money, the fact that we see gas on sale outside for $1.60 something right now, it's kind of incredible. But at the time, this was a shock to the economy because it didn't. No one had really thought about paying this much for gas, and it was a sign of a bigger crisis, which is the idea that we started to really realize that energy was finite. So the 70s is known as the period of the energy crisis, where we first began to learn that, there gets to be a point where, we just always thought there would be enough energy to always fuel any industrial thing that we wanted to do, and now we kind of realize that there's still an element of scarcity involved in that. And that has led, especially in recent decades, to trying to, put more work into like renewable energies and alternative energies. And I think all that is good work, even though some people have spent billions of dollars chasing windmills on that. No pun intended. But I mean, I do think, at some point you've got to find something that can replace gasoline, but you can't do it today like some of the Greens want you to pretend that you can. Speaking of the Greens, part of what's going on with the economy is the beginnings of the environmental movement. And I am quite a critic of the contemporary environmental movement because I think they've done a few things that are just nonsensical. I mean, when you've got a situation like unfolded in California over the last few years, where there are literally farmers that are having to go out of business because they can't do certain things to their farms because they're trying to protect some really rare tree species of fish that's no different than any of another 100 species of fish. Stuff like that just makes me want to punch someone in the throat. But for the record, YouTube, I'm not endorsing political violence. It's sarcasm. So, nonetheless, there was a good reason for the environmental movement to get started, because there was a serious pollution problem in the 1970s. Just watch a movie from the 1970s that filmed like on location in the streets of New York, and there's just a grunginess to just the looks of it, just from walking on the street, and it's because there really was terrible smog in all these cities. There still can be in some places, but it's not like it was. Really, the real impetus for the foundation of the EPA was when I think it was the Cuyahoga River in Ohio, but one of the rivers in Ohio literally caught on fire. And you can find footage of it on YouTube. It's just rolling down the water just with a flame on top. Like, water is not supposed to burn. If the water is burning, there's some things on there that don't need to be on there. And so, I think there's, if you look at what are the things the government is supposed to do, I think providing for, the security of the people and for common infrastructure for which to have a functioning economy. I think those basic things that it is supposed to do. I think environmental protection can fit with those things. I just think they need to dial it back a little bit in recent decades. But nonetheless, so the first major environmental legislation is passed in the early 70s, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, passed in the first half of the decade, and the establishment of the EPA happens, I think, either as a consequence of those acts or shortly thereafter. But as even though it may have been a good thing, the new environmental legislation probably came at the wrong time for the stagnating economy of the 1970s, because we've got this oil crisis, and then simultaneous to that, we're having to decrease how much coal we're using. And in decreasing the coal, that's the most plentiful resource that we have for producing power, at least at the time. And so that was kind of further exacerbated the energy crisis of the 70s. So one thing that happens in the 70s is it's kind of a once-in-a-lifetime economic problem. That is, and it became known as stagflation. And stagflation was a combination of two terms: stagnation and inflation. What tends to happen, it's very rare for unemployment and high inflation to happen at the same time. Typically, when you have high employment, there's a lot of dollars out there chasing the goods, and so this causes inflation. Typically, when you have high inflation, when you have low inflation, it's because there's not a lot of money circulating, which means that unemployment tends to stay high. So it's a trade-off. Inflation is hyperinflation, that is inflation that goes beyond steady rates of inflation. Most economists think the healthiest thing for the economy to do is to grow at such a rate that there's about 3% inflation on an annual basis. The problem is if you have too much inflation too quick, salaries don't keep up with the new cost of goods, and you wind up with people who have fixed incomes or money saved, or people that are owed money wind up losing on their investments and savings, because those are based on a fixed value, and that fixed value is not buying as much as it used to. Inflation is actually good for you if you're in debt, because you get to pay people back, and you almost wind up breaking even on the interest sometimes. But if you are someone who lends money, inflation's a bad deal for you. Anyway, typically there's a trade-off. We recognize inflation is a problem. We recognize unemployment is a problem. You normally have one or the other. In the 70s, we found a way to have both at the same time, and that is the economic worst-case scenario. So how did this happen? How this happened was a handful of factors kind of combining at once. So the energy crisis drove up the prices of everything. So the energy crisis creates its own inflation, because think about it. Every product that is on a store shelf, was delivered by a truck. Every one of these books that are on the shelf here behind me, at some point got to me by being shipped in a truck. So literally everything that you buy is affected by the rate of shipping, and the rate of shipping is related to the ability to gas up not just cars, but 18-wheelers. So the price of everything goes up when energy prices inflate too quickly. And in this case, so the Arab oil embargo causes part of it. Then President Johnson had created a big budget deficit by trying to fund the Vietnam War and the Great Society without raising taxes, just running a big deficit in debt. That kind of causes inflation because of the way that the stock market, or not the stock market, but the way that the Federal Reserve Bank is structured and all this stuff. We'll talk about more of that next year in economics. But regardless, long and short of it is high national deficits create inflation. And then on top of that, to cover the deficit, we started like printing more money, and that made it worse. And then the third thing was moving away from the gold standard. So, and this was a decision that President Nixon made because we had, and the reason he did it was because there was a year in the early 70s where we actually imported more than we exported for the first time. And so you had a lot of people holding, Europeans in particular, holding American currency and exchanging it for gold and taking money out of circulation to an extent that Nixon didn't like. And so he just said, we're not going to do the gold standard anymore. We're going to... Okay, I had a little thing bothering my view there. I'm sorry. So Nixon just says, we're going to go off the gold standard. We're going to run everything based on fiat money, meaning it's good because the government and the Federal Reserve Bank says it is. So this causes inflation because there's no anchor for it anymore. So all of that adding together causes there to be high inflation in the midst of a time of low economic growth. And that's a trade-off you don't normally have. And this continues for most of the 1970s. We'll talk about the Carter presidency tomorrow. But Carter, when he's president from 76 to 80, or 77 to 81 technically, but he's elected in 76. When in his presidency, he gives this one famous speech where he talked about the long malaise that has affected the American people, which is not exactly inspiring leadership talk, but there's just this kind of sense of, maybe the bubble's busted, maybe this is, maybe we peaked a few years ago and it's all downhill from here, was kind of the sense that a lot of people were getting from American growth and so on. So in addition to all the economic uncertainty, you also had some social uncertainty. And in addition to all the other social currents we've talked about, one of the major additions to this in the 1970s is the increasing prominence of the idea of feminism. There's a pastor I listen to sometimes who made a joke one time that he said, the movement to make women act more like men was called feminism, which is like having a movement to make cats act more like dogs and calling it felinism, which I think is the greatest quote about feminism I've ever heard. Nonetheless, when the feminist movement becomes mainstream largely because they had a couple of decent points. One was there was some economic mistreatment of women in the workplace where women were not being promoted as high as their competence could allow, the whole glass ceiling concept. Where they were being paid less for the same work, and where laws tended to favor men in economic situations in certain strange ways. Like, for instance, if a man died, the woman's credit score the widow's credit score would drop, but if a woman died, the widower's credit score wouldn't. So things like that were just unfair, and they had very good points about those things, and that sort of thing got them some attention from the mainstream, and some of those things, were worked on and improved. I mean, really, I think nowadays people that still claim that there's a major women's pay gap, I think is a little bit untrue, because you'll notice most of it is connected to men and women making different career decisions, and some of that's just stuff that's just based on their personal interest in the fields that they tend to go into. Obviously, you've got 1,000 feminists who will argue with me, but I've got sources. I've researched this stuff a little bit. However, there was a more radical edge to the feminism of the 60s and 70s, and the more radical edge became known as the women's liberation movement. And the women's liberation movement and kind of the second wave, second and third wave feminism, I think, are one of the worst things that ever happened to American culture, to be honest. Now, obviously, that's my opinion. Don't shoot me if you're angry at me. You're entitled to think how you want to think, but in my opinion, there was a lot of destructive stuff that came along with it. I think it was G.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic social thinker and essayist, made a comment one time that feminism teaches that a woman trying to do work for a family that loves her is slavery, but trying to do work for a boss that doesn't care about her is empowerment. I think there's some truth in that. And so you had this. So as as much as it's a good thing that before the 70s, there were a lot of women were not really able to do with their talents what they had in their heart to do, and that was a sad thing. But now, after the 1970s, there gets to be a pressure that makes it very difficult. Social pressure makes it harder for a woman who does want to stay at home to do it, because the influx of so many women in the workplace causes a increasing supply of labor, which brings down the overall cost of labor. That's just the basic laws of supply and demand applied to labor as well. And so as a result of that, it's now difficult for a family that does want to do one income to do it, because back in the old days, you had about half the people working, and so they were getting about the same money for the husband working as they now are getting for the husband and the wife working. And then meanwhile, the fact of the matter is, a lot of times the wife still gets stuck with a lot of the child care and household duties, but that she used to have to do for free. Now she's having to do them for free and having to work, outside the home to make ends meet to stay at the same level they would have been at a previous time. So it's become a little bit of a trap. Believe it or not, I mean, even Elizabeth Warren, who you think of as a super feminist, kind of admitted this in some of her earlier academic work before she got involved in politics and had to toe the party line a little bit more. So that's one thing. You do have fewer homes where women are able to stay at home even if they want to. I agree that they should be able to work outside the home if they want to, but I hate that it's harder for people who don't want to not. One thing that goes along with the radical edge of the women's liberation movement as well is it continues the same thing when we talked to the lesson we did on the counterculture. It kind of continued the change of people's views of sexual morality that's referred to as the sexual revolution. And that has led to huge increases in the rates of divorce, huge increases in the amount of unwed parents, which typically it's, the way it's worked, that's typically been the mom getting stuck with the unwed kid, which is not a good thing, but that's typically the way that it has played out. So if you want to say that this has been great for women, please explain why you've got so many women having to raise children alone now that used to have, husbands to raise them with. Just in all the kind of, all the broken hearts and emotional stuff that goes along with the culture of people, not saving themselves for marriage the way they used to, and that sort of thing. So that was a destructive thing. Another destructive thing was, this is by far the most important of them, was the nationwide legalization of abortion. Now, abortion had not been illegal in all 50 states for some time. It had been legalized in a handful of states before this. But in 1973, the Supreme Court made the worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court. And I say that fully aware of Dred Scott and, I think it's Korematsu was the Japanese internment camp decision. I mean, there's a lot of bad decisions that they've made. I think this is the most, directly problematic one was Roe versus Wade, a 1973 Supreme Court case finds a constitutional right to abortion somewhere in the Constitution. They claim the logic of it is just insane, but they claim that they found that as an implied right within the rights of, to avoid police search and seizure and so on. They claim that there's an implied right to privacy that included the right to make a decision related to abortion. And again, the proponents of abortion rights kind of claimed it to be a woman's health issue. The problem is, it's not the health of the woman that's being affected, it's the health of the other person, which is the child in the womb. And so because of the legalization of abortion in 1973, since then, there have been right around 60 million legal abortions in the United States in those last, it's almost, 47 years now. 60 million. That is an unbelievable number of lives lost through abortion, which has been, I think, the most significant of many significant, stains on America's moral history. So, so 1973 really begins kind of the legal slaughter of of the children, and then on top of that, connected to and associated with the feminist movement is the beginning of the gay rights movement, which doesn't really go mainstream until the late 90s. But it starts to gain, it starts in the 70s, starts to gain a little bit of ground in the 80s, a little bit of ground in the 90s, then it really takes off in the 2000s. And I think that's had really destructive impacts on how people conceive of, sexual and family matters, and it's led to, a lot of, ungodly activities going on, and even the state recognition of them in recent years. But the background of all that was, a lot of the mental framework for how America eventually accepted that was based on the fact that they had already accepted certain ideas from the feminist movement, that gender was not an important distinction between people, that marriage was not to be thought of in a way that was built around creating a strong family structure, but it's intended to be a method for the romantic fulfillment of of adults or whatever. So there was a whole lot of and you never get to the state trying to change the definition of marriage if you don't first have laws like the no-fault divorce laws that were passed in the 70s, including unfortunately by in California by Governor Ronald Reagan, unfortunately, who winds up being one of the great presidents we had, but I dislike several things he did when he was governor. So the no-fault divorce laws, which it used to be, if you wanted to get a divorce, you had to have a reason. There had to have been, some kind of adultery or some kind of, serious problem that you could prove. And now, in the 70s, they kind of changed the laws to where you can kind of get a divorce just because you wake up on the wrong side of the bed one day and decide you want to. And so that leads to the situation where, probably even at a Christian school like this, probably half of y'all, have broken homes, in your background. So, that was not like that in a previous generation. And so that's not been good for people of your age or people of my age. Was really maybe even in some ways just as bad, or in some ways worse statistically as far as divorces are concerned. So because ultimately, I mean, it's been proven, social science have proven it over and over again. Even if we didn't already have the witness of the scripture and stuff saying that we're supposed to have stable homes with permanent marriages between a husband and a wife. Even if you didn't have the scriptural witness, I think even just social science and economics and stuff have proven over and over again that the best way for success is to have stable home environments. So all of this stuff, all these ways that we kind of got off the path on those sorts of matters in the 60s and 70s has a tremendously devastating impact on American culture and society. The high point of so the Roe versus Wade decision, 1973. We'll talk about this kind of more in the next video. It really is kind of the awakening point of kind of social conservatism, and leads to another level of kind of conservative Christian involvement in politics in a way that I think was helpful for a period of time and then became counterproductive in my view. But we can talk about that some other time. But I think the reason I say that, just to clarify, I think it was a good thing for Christians to start getting involved in politics, but then the church made such an idol out of politics that people associate Christians with their politics now more than they do with the gospel, and that combined with the fact that in politics you wind up having to make so many compromises with people that don't really represent the gospel. It's not good for the reputation of the church in the long run, in my view, to be that closely associated with political causes. But that being said, it kind of had to happen because there kind of had to be a moment where people stood up and said, you know what, we can't just let the government tell us that abortion was a constitutional right when it clearly was not. We need to do something about this. And if you want to know why there's so much tension around the appointment of Supreme Court justices nowadays, that's because this is another example. We talked in that kind of judicial activism video that we did that we did last week about how many different really novel Supreme Court decisions happened during this period of time, where it really became evident that that branch of government was really marking itself as almost a second legislature in certain key arenas. So other than the Roe versus Wade incident, the high mark of fighting over the women's rights movement, as far as politics is concerned, is the attempt to pass a constitutional amendment known as the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, which would have basically amended the law in such a way as to do away with the right of the government to make distinctions between sex. The ERA was marketed to people as sort of ensuring protections for civil rights for women and economic matters and stuff like that. But it became clear that the way the text was worded was going to lead to a lot of radical stuff. And actually, the person who really emerges as the leader of the pushback against the ERA was a woman by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who was a politically active, basically a housewife, but she had done some political stuff in her spare time, including being delegate to the RNC convention and stuff. She actually ran for Congress on a couple occasions, though she never became a congressman. Co-wrote a book during the Goldwater campaign that helped with Goldwater's race. Schlafly emerges as the spokeswoman against the ERA, and being that she was a woman, that gave her kind of a little bit better platform to push back at it than most of the male critics of it would have had. And so she starts going around kind of telling people what would happen if the ERA passes. And it was stuff like, if the ERA passes, we're going to have homosexual marriages. If the ERA passes, we're going to have women be drafted and have to go fight in the next Vietnam. If the ERA passes, it's going to be against the law to have separate men's and women's restrooms. It's going to be against the law to have, separate girls sports teams. And all the stuff that she was saying, everyone said, "Oh, she's lying. That's ridiculous. That'll never happen. You're insane. Who would do any of those things?" And now, 30 years later, we've got gay marriages. Men are now allowed to use women's bathrooms as long as they call themselves a she, which is all they have to do to call themselves a she is just say that's what they are and that's my pronouns, and you call me that, bigot, or else. Now men are winning many of the women's sports championships right now. Women are now, fighting in combat. And as recently as 2016, it came up in the presidential debates because the Army had just allowed women to start taking combat roles. And they said, should women have to, in the interest of equality, should women register for the draft? And all the Democrats and about half of the Republicans said yes, which is absolutely insane. If you try to force my sister to go fight people with a gun, that's the moment where I'm officially no longer supporting the United States government. So that is insane. So, the thing is, they all said all of those things were ridiculous. They would never happen. And then meanwhile, the ERA actually was defeated. The ERA didn't pass, but all of those things happened because so many states and non-constitutional congressional laws were passed that basically use some of that similar language. So the ERA is not a part of the Constitution, but it's been functionally enshrined inside of both the federal law and a number of state laws, including state constitutions. So I know of one conservative commentator who likes to talk about the idea of the law of merited impossibility, which means, which is his way of expressing the thought that a lot of liberals like to use, that will never happen, and if it does, you'll deserve it. And so, when Phyllis Schlafly was saying those things about the ERA, everyone said that's insane. You're lying to people. You're demagoguing. That's being extreme. And then all of those things happened exactly like she called. So anyway, so that was awkward to have to do live on the internet, but feminism of the 1970s, not really a good thing for America, although some good things came with it as far as, women being able to be promoted to the level of their competency and dealing with some of the paid discrimination and stuff like that. So I don't want to throw the whole baby out with the bathwater, but let's be clear that is a lot of bathwater. Maybe it's more like trying to think of an analogy. It's more like straining out the handful of good things out of a truckload of bad things than vice versa, I would say. But you're entitled to your own opinion. I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just I think sometimes it's less biased to explain what your viewpoint is than to try to pretend to be neutral about things and then skew things in such a way that they take a certain opinion. So I'm just being open about the fact that I'm not a big fan of some of this stuff. So anyway, y'all have yourselves a good day, and talk to you later. Hopefully I don't get banned. All right.